Good morning, everybody. Apologies for not being able to do a full live review, but I'm hoping that this can answer a lot of the questions that you might be having related to Unit 4. If you have any questions after watching this video, you're more than welcome to send me a message or anything like that. Pop by my room in the morning, whether that would be hopefully Wednesday, because I'm thinking that tomorrow's going to be a, fingers crossed, snow day. But if not, whatever. Like, we'll touch base. And if you have questions, I'll try to answer them as best I can. So, Unit 4, 1800 to 1848, critical unit. It's a really big moment of transition. I would call this America's teen years, is a metaphor that I've used for my classes. And the reason I call it the teen years is we go from going out of our infancy under Washington and Adams, and now we sort of figure out our identity going through a new phase of Democratic Republican control. By 1848, America has beat England a second time. We've undergone a rise of our early American culture and a sense of cultural nationalism. We've built a national economy with our market revolution. We've gone and even sort of tried to rectify the problems of our teen years, the vices and problems that are emerging in this industrial urbanizing society, and then dealing with the number one issue of our lifetime. And that will lead into our next unit, the issue of slavery. And so this is a really big one into understanding this transition in American history between, Washington's era and the Civil War. So let's talk about it, starting with the year 1800, when Thomas Jefferson becomes the first Democratic Republican elected to the presidency. Now, if we remember, in our first unit in 1788, Washington assumes the presidency. And for 12 years, Federalists have control of the White House and other key institutions like the Supreme Court and Congress, and they dominate politics. And this allows for Hamilton's vision for the future to really come to fruition, right? We see a national bank established. He has an excise tax on whiskey, which leads to a rebellion in Western Pennsylvania, establishing some early tariffs. And so with this sort of Federalist control, it's alienating lots of people in the population that see the Federalists as New England elites that don't have the average person's sort of perspective in mind. And in the year 1800, Thomas Jefferson is going to run on a platform of this Democratic Republican control. And so when Jefferson sort of creates a Democratic Republicans with James Madison and others, he wants to rein in the power of government, right? He sees Hamilton's big government, his big financial plan as being overemphasizing the powers allowed by the Constitution. He also does not support how close we've grown with England, who was the country in which we sort of fought back against during the Revolution. And so Jefferson, if we remember, and Democratic Republicans tend to align a little bit more with France. So it's no wonder we end up going to war with England under Democratic Republican control. Now, this is going to lead to a big shift, right? A big difference in the vision between Hamilton and then the vision of Jefferson. So if we remember, Hamilton and the Federalists during the early sort of American century, or should I say the early American period of independence, they want a strong government. They want a powerhouse economy. And so they believe a strong government could encourage manufacturing, banking, and trade. And so Hamilton is very much of the belief that we need to industrialize. It's no wonder that Henry Clay and his American system so model the Federalist Party's platform, even though Clay is a Democratic Republican. Now, down the line, Jefferson has a very different vision. His is that of an agrarian republic based in farm-based control, yeoman farmers, where everybody is independent of a boss. They don't have somebody that is necessarily telling them how to live their lives. And so Jefferson's vision is that of independent thinkers. We don't need this big government telling us what to do. We don't need a factory owner telling us how to live our lives as independent workers. He believes that everybody should have control of their own domain. And so when Jefferson takes over, there is pause, right? There is this sort of nervous feeling that, when power exchanged from one party to the next, it could lead to violence. But fortunately, in America, in the early revolutionary period, into the year 1800, we see a transfer of power which is peaceful. They call this a peaceful revolution, and Jefferson sums it up at his inauguration, saying that today we are all Federalists, we are all Democratic Republicans, like we're all on the same team. And so this is a big moment for America as we transfer power from one party to the next. Now, when Jefferson becomes president, he is going to try and undo much of what the Federalists had done, including cutting military spending, repealing the whiskey tax, getting rid of the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were very controversial in our last unit. He pushed for smaller government, tried to reduce the national debt. He also allows for the national bank charter to expire. And so Jefferson is very successful early on at winding back the Federalist program. But I will say that Jefferson, in other ways, struggles to establish a fully strict constitutionalist vision. And one problem for him is that there are some factors outside of his control. When the Federalists are in power, they are going to appoint various Federalist judges, including John Marshall, who, despite being Thomas Jefferson's cousin, is somebody that believes in a very loose interpretation of the Constitution. So under Jefferson's power and other Democratic Republicans, we're going to see that John Marshall is going to continue to sort of allow the federal government to do things that aren't necessarily written in the Constitution. One case in which we see, John Marshall establishing a powerful Supreme Court is that of Marbury versus Madison. Long story short, this is the first case in which we'd see the federal government, or should I say the Supreme Court, striking down a federal law. And this would allow for later on, when instances where the federal government does things outside the control of what's in the Constitution, the Supreme Court can strike it down using the power of judicial review. Don't get too hung up in the case facts. It's a lot of information for not much of a conclusion. The conclusion being that now the Supreme Court can strike down laws. I would argue a much bigger case, which would take place down the line after Jefferson's presidency, but under Democratic Republican control, was that of Maryland versus McCulloch, where, long story short, John Marshall determines that the federal government, specifically Congress, can do things outside of the Constitution. They have implied powers, and they can apply that necessary and proper clause for a loose interpretation. Basically, he says a loose interpretation is allowed. So that's a big thing. Now, the biggest issue for Jefferson, though, in terms of getting his strict constructionist views in line, are that of the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase is a big moment where Jefferson is going to ignore the Constitution in order to do something pretty impactful. The Louisiana Purchase took place in 1803. If we remember, Napoleon, who was the leader of France at this time, was going to sort of scale back his empire in the Americas after losing Haiti. And so Jefferson was going to just try to buy New Orleans from France, but instead they offer us the entire plot of Louisiana for $15 million. And this is going to lead to Lewis and Clark's expedition out west to go and survey the land, map out from east to west coast, and to try and get a better sense of what's out there. Now, Jefferson has a bit of a moral crisis because he believes that the federal government needs to follow the Constitution to the word. But he ignores the Constitution in purchasing this thing. And when we purchase Louisiana, he does this because not only is the deal so good, right? It's a big plot of land for not a lot of money. It's also going to allow for him to have his agrarian republic, right? Think of all the farmland out in the West that can be available now to, these folks who are on the East Coast and want to move out to the West. Now, Federalists are very critical, even though history has vindicated Jefferson. Federalists feared that it could create a crisis around slavery. And will I just say that is definitely something that comes up in this unit and will be the future of our next unit. This big question of what happens when we move west? What will be of slaveholding states versus non-slaveholding states? These are big questions that matter quite a bit and will be essential to understanding next unit. Now, Jefferson, during his presidency, is dealing with domestic issues. And yes, he is dealing with sort of scaling back the Federalist agenda. He's also dealing with international issues. And in 1800, America would be put onto the world stage very quickly. And by the time Jefferson's out of office, we would basically be ready to go to war. So the first test of strength that Jefferson dealt with were Barbary pirates. We're on the coast of North Africa as we're trading with European countries and other countries way out west. We would see that these pirates, because we're so far away, would go and basically take these floating treasure chests at sea, our trade vessels. And so when this happens, Jefferson has to send our Navy out there to go and fight on the shores of Tripoli. If you've ever heard, I forget the Academy fight song. I want to say it's the Marine Corps. Features that sort of phrase, which basically just mentions the fact that we were going out and defending our trade ships off the coast of Northern Africa. Now, the last unit, we saw issues like the Jay Treaty, the seizing of American ships, the Alien and Sedition Acts. We had been caught up between France and Britain for quite some time, right? France and Britain had been to war many, many times, and whenever they go to war, they don't like us trading with their enemy. And so seizing American ships was a very common tactic for them to undermine their enemy, right? If we're trading with Britain, France gets an easy win by seizing American ships to stop those goodies from getting to England. And so this would be an issue time and time again as we get into the early 1800s because France and Britain are at war constantly. Now, Britain begins cracking down a little bit on the United States, even off the shores of the U.S. So the British ship, the Leopard, fires on the U.S. warship, the Chesapeake, what we call the Chesapeake Leopard affair, because the British accused the Americans of basically taking stowaways, people that wanted to run away from the Napoleonic Wars and escape. And so when that happens, Jefferson begins to grow tired of the antics between Britain and France. And so he is going to pass the Embargo Act. And this is going to basically prevent the U.S. from sailing anywhere. Now, if you want American goods, you got to almost like drive to McDonald's to go through the drive-through, come to the U.S. ports, buy your goods. No more Uber Eats. We're not delivering out to you guys because you keep messing with our drivers, right? Our sailors on the high seas. But this is going to backfire majorly because the Embargo Act is going to have a significant impact on the American economy. So when Madison takes over in 1808 after Jefferson, he is going to try to navigate these issues. So the first thing he does is he reopens up our trade with every country but Britain and France. Now, they are our biggest customers historically, and Madison needs to come to a decision. Who shall we side with? And ultimately, Napoleon says he'll stop seizing our ships, so we align with France leading into 1812. And this is going to lead to divisions between the U.S. and England. There are other causes of the War of 1812, though, of course, including the fact that we have these very aggressive young men in office who believe that we should go to war with England to prove ourselves and then go and take their territory of Canada. This was a way for us to sort of prove our military might. And these guys were called the Warhawks. They are names that you will know from this unit: Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. In addition to that, there are rumors swirling that on the western frontier, Native Americans are getting British guns, and they're going to have this big revolution. And so people get very skeptical of the British and these Native Americans. And ultimately, Native Americans do join the British during the wars of 1812. Now, the war is fought. In APUSH, you don't really need to know the battles or the generals, but you need to know its causes and its effects. And these are the effects of the War of 1812. Number one, America is able to hold up. We aren't defeated by Great Britain. And this allows for the U.S. to sort of establish itself again as a rising global power. We would also see that we get a firm border with Canada. One big issue from the War of 1812, though, is the Federalists meet in Hartford during the Hartford Convention, and they hate the War of 1812. If we remember, the Federalists did not like this war. The Federalists really rely on trade relationships with Britain, and so they begin to freak out a little bit. And this is because, they're losing a lot of money. And so what would happen is they meet in Hartford and they threaten to secede, reform the Constitution, get rid of the Three-Fifths Compromise. But because we end up not losing this war shortly after the Hartford Convention, the Federalists are deemed to be untouchable, right? They are like totally seen as like ungrateful, unpatriotic. And so we're going to see a big shift away from the Federalist Party in turn. Native Americans are going to become susceptible to white settlement as they sort of turned against the U.S., even though the U.S. had never treated Native Americans very nicely. And ultimately, we are going to enter an era of nationalism. Now, one example of this nationalism is the Monroe Doctrine, where in 1815, President Monroe basically says that no European monarchies are going to come and mess with the revolutionary movements of South America. And so, more or less, the United States are not going to tolerate Europe messing with revolutionary movements in the Americas, especially in South America, because we see folks in Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador fighting for their independence against Spain. And the U.S. is like, go team, you're just like us fighting against England. So in turn, we enter an era of good feelings. And this is a big moment in U.S. history as we emerge out of the War of 1812. I would say we are exiting our teen years and moving into our 20s, if you will, where America is sort of feeling confidence and, no longer sort of stuck in the, burdens of high school life. Like we finally have something good going for us. And the era of good feelings we associate with the War of 1812, which resulted in a U.S. not loss, not quite a major victory. We didn't achieve all our objectives, but we didn't lose. And because of this, America feels very good coming out of the war. So I mentioned already the Hartford Convention. One of the big elements of the era of good feelings is political unity, everyone coming together. Well, it helps when one of two parties falls off the face of the earth. And this is what happens with the Federalists as they sort of are deemed, again, untouchable. They are like they've gone too far in their criticism of the war, and they seem unpatriotic. So ultimately, the Federalists are going to begin getting crushed. When Rufus King runs for office in 1816, he is only able to capture several states in New England. And this is going to ultimately, down the line, lead to further acquisition of the Democratic Republican power. One of the reasons for this is because Monroe, after he wins in 1816, goes on a tour of New England where all the Federalists lived and basically is like, guys, like we're all on the same team here, right? Like those Federalists, they weren't very patriotic during the War of 1812. Like, join the Democratic Republicans. Like, we are the future of America. We're carrying on that revolutionary spirit. And Monroe really drives that home by wearing his Revolutionary War uniform as he goes on tour. Now, if we take a look here in 1820, the Democratic Republicans crush the Federalists. And so this is a big moment where we see a lot of unity, an era of good feelings, so to speak. Now, not all moments from this time period were good. One element that was not so great was that we had our first panic in 1819. One of the biggest issues that we saw was that the post-war economic situation, where France and Britain were at war for a long time, well, France and Britain kiss and make up, and they begin trading with each other. And this is going to make a problem for America. We were basically part of that triangle trade. Well, they kind of leave us alone. And this is going to make it so that our national bank struggles to, as people are starting to lose money, to continue to dole out credit to the American people. And when they sort of rein in the credit in 1819, it's going to slow westward expansion. It's going to hurt the economy. And we're going to see that banks begin to become a little bit less trustworthy. We're also going to see a lot of people go into debt during this time period, which would be a really big deal ultimately. And that's going to have a big impact on Andrew Jackson's presidency. America, however, does sign a really big treaty to get access to Florida. We get that from Spain, and this is allowing America to expand a little bit more, the Adams-Honest Treaty. We also have the Missouri Compromise during this time period. Missouri Compromise is really important. It combines two ideas. Number one, the Louisiana Purchase and westward expansion, right? As we're moving west into the Louisiana Territory, the question became, is it going to be slaveholding or non-slaveholding? And this became a really big deal as new states were entered, and the balance in the Senate became a little bit less and less equal. If you take a look down here, it was up until 1821, or excuse me, up until 1820, it was all equal. And then in 1821, the question became, as Maine is entered and Missouri is entered, if they are both free states, this could be a really big problem for the South, who saw basically anybody not becoming slaveholding as a threat to their right to own slaves. And I know that sounds a little bit weird, but think about it this way. If the balance went to the free states and they have control of Congress, they could pass a law to end the institution of slavery at the federal level. And so this led to a compromise where basically they determined that any new territory above the 3630 line, this one right here, would be basically non-slaveholding except for Missouri. That would allow for the balance to keep, and then any below that would be slaveholding. Now, the problem will become in our next unit, we continue to expand. We're going to add Texas and all these other states here after the Mexican-American War. This leads to further controversies over whether or not slavery should go to that land or not. I've already mentioned the Monroe Doctrine, but just as a reminder, it's another example of nationalism as we emerge out of the War of 1812. Okay, let's keep it moving. And one other big element during this time period of the era of good feelings, as we begin to expand under Madison and Monroe, is that of Indian removal. The policy of Indian removal in 1825 begins with Monroe, and it would be enhanced by the Indian Removal Act passed by Andrew Jackson. This is not an era of good feelings for Native Americans, but it is an era of good feelings for white settlers who were the primary, audience of Democratic Republican politics. They play into the farmer, the agrarian republic, right? And so by providing this land to white settlement, this is going to allow for more sort of farmland in Georgia and in the South more generally. Okay, my favorite part of this unit, the market revolution, right? As we emerge out of the War of 1812, something I really didn't mention was that we get cut off from British trade. This is a really big problem. Basically, Britain made all of our stuff. We would send them raw material. They would make it into something, send it back to us. We enjoy the products. Here's the problem. We get cut off from them, and all of a sudden, America is without its biggest trade partner. So what do? We begin to start industrializing ourselves. This is despite the fact that Democratic Republicans wanted that agrarian republic based on farming. Now, during the War of 1812, right, again, we usually rely on Britain. We need to now innovate for ourselves. We need to have our own factories where we can make our own stuff because we got cut off from Britain. Another big cause of the market revolution is the fact that America is becoming more and more spread out. Now we have states all the way out there in Minnesota and Wisconsin that take weeks and weeks to get to. And then we have people in New York. We need to connect these things. So there's going to be a big push for infrastructure, right? The building of roads and canals. And finally, we're going to have politicians emerging who, despite the fact that Democratic Republicans are in control, are going to try and drum up a game plan for the future American economy emerging out of the War of 1812. And the main architect of that plan is a gentleman by the name of Henry Clay from Kentucky. Now, Kentucky is considered on the frontier, like kind of far from New York and Boston. And so he is somebody that wants his state to be connected to these other regions. And so what he is going to push for is, number one, protective tariffs. And these tariffs are going to make it so that American goods would be cheaper than foreign goods, so people would want to buy American. Two, he supports a strong national bank. He wants to bring it back. And so we would see this ultimately around 1816 as the American plan kicks off under Monroe. And then finally, we have the federal funding of infrastructure. Now, it's important to note that Democratic Republicans did allow for a national bank to come back, though they would also allow for it to go away under Jackson. But in turn, they weren't the biggest fans of government spending. And so what we would see is that a lot of the canals are being built by state governments. For example, the Erie Canal, built by DeWitt Clinton in the state of New York. We would also have, the National Road built by Thomas Jefferson. We're going to see an infrastructure which is going to connect our country. And this is going to ultimately lead to a less agrarian republic and one that's more based in machinery, stuff like that. And this is going to change the labor force. People are no longer working at home with their families on the family farm. They are now leaving and going to the office or the factory, earning a salary rather than sort of working for themselves. And this is going to lead to some pretty dramatic changes. One example of this is going to be huge wave of immigration as people are looking for factory opportunities. There is a lot of low-paying, low-wage jobs available in the US, but there's also a lot of problems happening in Europe. And so in the lower classes, we are going to see a massive wave of immigration where people are coming to settle in the United States, living in poor urban centers, and are going to be, living in cities in pretty slummy conditions. We're going to talk a lot about that down the line. But this is a big movement and a big change which would emerge. Another big change which would emerge from the market revolution is the fact that women are now kind of left to tend for the household as men go and work in the factory or go to work in the office. And this led to this movement called the cult of domesticity, where an emphasis was placed on a woman's role in the household. Now, this is going to lead to some women who are unhappy with their status, wanting more for themselves. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. Just to prove my point here about the wave of migration, here is the market revolution, and it begins a tidal wave of migration into the early 1900s as we become a more urban and a more manufacturing-based society. Now, in the Northeast, during the market revolution, the North and the Northeast becomes the specialization of manufacturing. This is where we're going to see the Lowell mills. This is where we're going to see textile production, thanks to the spinning jenny and the power loom, the factory system. We're also going to have this as the central place of banking and finance. This is why New York City has Wall Street, which has a lot of, finance firms who invest in companies around the country, which is a really big deal. We're also going to see most immigrants are moving to places like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia during this time period. Hence, like Little Italy, Chinatown, right, begins to emerge in these places. Now, the South, because of the cotton gin in 1793, is going to become the Cotton Kingdom. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but slavery is going to expand from just really the East Coast all the way out to the borders of Texas. And obviously, cotton becomes king, and this would be sent up to the Northeast to be manufactured into clothing and textiles. And just to show you, slavery is going to quadruple in its numbers during this time. And then out west, in places like Iowa, Minnesota, etc., we're going to start to see the beginnings of commercial farming, where the farmer has new stuff like the steel plow and the mechanical reaper, who are able to grow crops and then send them back to the east, thanks to the railroad, the Erie Canal, the National Road, beginning to link all these markets up. And so while we have these great advancements in transportation, communication, like the telegraph, it's going to create an interconnected but very different regional or sectional economy. Sectionalism is going to be on the rise, where we have different ways of life in different economies and therefore different priorities in these different American regions. Okay, we are probably about 2/3, halfway done at this point, as we enter the era of Andrew Jackson. So if we remember, the era of good feelings is marked by an era of political unity. But as time would go on, there would be different visions for the Democratic Republican Party. And Andrew Jackson is going to ascend to the presidency in 1828 and become a very divisive person, leading to the creation of another two-party system. We're going to go from a basically unitarian or one-party system to a two-party system again under the presidency of Andrew Jackson. Now, Jackson is somebody that has a reputation when he runs for president. He was captured by the British during the American Revolution when he was a teenager, and was somebody that has a prowess for violent confrontation. In fact, Jackson kills a man in a duel in 1806. In this fight, Jackson takes a shot in his rib cage, which would remain in his body the rest of his days. But Jackson ultimately kills the man and, takes these skills to the military, where in 1812, he earns himself the title of a military hero. I'd compare him in some ways to George Washington in the way in which he sort of cultivates a reputation for being a military hero that serves you pretty nicely when you're campaigning for president, right? You're considered an American war hero. That can definitely help you out. So one thing that helped Jackson ascend to the presidency is the fact that he felt very connected to your average citizens. And during this time period, in the early 1820s, most states get rid of their property requirements for voting. That's because of that panic of 1819. A lot of your average citizens find themselves in debtors' prisons. And this is a big deal because your average person feels very upset with the government. And so they want a guy who they can relate to. That's Jackson. Jackson tries to appeal to the common man, not only with his tales of the war, but the fact that he was orphaned at 13. He wasn't raised in some bougie mansion, let alone the president's mansion, like his opponent in 1824, John Quincy Adams. And when John Quincy Adams wins the presidency in 1804, it's done on a technicality. If we remember, Jackson wins the popular vote and feels kind of gypped by the fact that Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams kind of work together to pull one over on Jackson and keep him out of the presidency. So this is going to galvanize the American people to side with Andrew Jackson. And Jackson as president is going to able to utilize the anger of the people to run a campaign. Jackson runs one of the first popular campaigns in U.S. history in which we would see parades, songs, and mudslinging to get people on Jackson's side. Jacksonians would even spread rumors about John Quincy Adams' wife cheating on John Quincy Adams. And he became a symbol of the common man. One other big thing that he does, though, is when he's president, he gives jobs to people that support him. And this is a really critical one. Andrew Jackson's spoil system is critical to understanding his presidency and how the early, or should I say, how 20th century politics or 19th century politics would play out, where we see people just assigning jobs to people based on their loyalty to the person in office. Now, Jackson is seen by his rivals as a king. They kind of label him as King Andrew I, and he does this because of the way that he runs his presidency, largely due to his vetoing of the rechartering of the National Bank. Henry Clay, who we remember established the American system, wanted it so that we had another national bank, but Jackson is totally not convinced by it. He sees it as this institution of elitism, which is going to, keep the common man down and make the rich even richer. And remember, Jackson runs as a common man, so he does not recharter the national bank and instead gives the power of the national bank and all its money back to these pet banks at the state level. So this bank war, which he fights, is going to be sort of a win for the average people until it leads to an economic crash in 1837. And again, his opponents see him as basically being a tyrant and ignoring Congress, who would pass the national bank's rechartering. It gets to the point where Henry Clay gets so mad about this that he's going to establish his own political party, the Whig Party. And the Whigs are a really important sort of group as we emerge into the mid-1800s, into the antebellum period. And if you look at their platform, guys, the Whig Party is basically the Federalists all over again. They're the Northeast bankers. They're the Northeast elites. They are going to become very, skeptical of the lower classes, especially in these cities, as we begin to see, immigrants moving to the United States. We're going to see them supporting big infrastructure projects, protective tariffs, national banks. They basically run on the American system. Whereas the Democrats sort of stick to the old Jeffersonian Democratic Republican model. Another big issue during Jackson's presidency is this policy of Indian removal. In 1830, Jackson passes a policy which he believes allows for him to move Native Americans from the Southeast in places like Georgia all the way out to Oklahoma and other places. Now, the Supreme Court says that this is unconstitutional and that states should not be able to remove Native Americans. But Andrew Jackson says, too bad, right? He tells John Marshall to basically take his ruling and put it where the sun don't shine. He says, John Marshall, you made your decision, now enforce it. Jackson's basically saying, I have the army, and so you're not going to tell me what to do. So Jackson is going to move these Native Americans, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, and various other groups from the Southeast to the West, the Cheyenne and other groups, to places like Oklahoma, the Dakotas, etc. Now, this is a big deal for Native Americans, and the Trail of Tears is going to be a really big deal as natives, unfortunately perish. Many of them die along the journey westward. Okay, the last big thing to know from Jackson's presidency is the nullification crisis. Now, Andrew Jackson in 1828 helps to pass a tariff which is going to try to protect American industry. The problem is the South disagrees with this tariff because the South is hit the hardest. Remember, the South doesn't have many factories, right? That's largely like a New England thing. And so they're like, these tariffs are just hurting our economy. We don't have any factories. This is very harmful to states like South Carolina. So John C. Calhoun is going to publish something called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. And it looks very similar to the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which were passed under Jefferson, or should I say under John Adams, right? When Jefferson and James Madison opposed the Alien and Sedition Acts. Basically, John C. Calhoun says that the South will not enforce this law. It goes against the Constitution. And he sort of uses this legal theory of nullification to back himself up. Now, Jackson threatens to bring in the military. He passes this force bill, which he's like, I'm going to bring in the troops and you are going to do what I say. But ultimately, it ends in a compromise with a lower tariff thanks to Henry Clay. But this is a signal that the South isn't necessarily always going to want to go along with what these federal officials have to say. Spoiler, next unit, Civil War. It's coming. Okay, we're going to start wrapping it up here, folks. One of the last couple of things we talked about was responses to the market revolution. So as the market revolution plays out and we have major changes in lifestyle, people are going to respond to that with changes in culture. Remember that during the market revolution, labor changes significantly. People now leave the house to go to work, and this is going to make people feel alienated from their labor. People start to feel like almost like a part of the machine rather than a worker. And this is going to cause many people to seek out sort of coping mechanisms to deal with this feeling of alienation and their unhappiness with these changes during the market revolution. One way in which we see this are artistic movements with emphasized nature and romanticizing nature, like the Hudson River School, who painted many landscapes during this time. We would also see an emphasis on literature, which would sort of eschew rationalism and emphasize this beauty of nature. So ignore where I say it emphasizes rationalism. It's quite the opposite. And so ultimately they, again, emphasize nature, imagination, beauty, rather than like the cold, hard mechanisms of the factory or something like that, right? We're also going to see transcendentalism emerge as a movement during this time period as Henry David Thoreau moves to Walden Pond and writes his story about how life is bigger than the things you buy, the job you work, the house you have. It's not about your worldly possessions. It's about sort of upholding truth and being, an empathetic human to others. This is going to sort of inspire Henry David Thoreau to refuse to pay his poll taxes, where he's ultimately arrested. And he refuses to go along with a country in which we see slavery being a big issue or wars against Mexico, as we'll talk about in our next unit. Thoreau is a very big advocate that we need to treat all people with decency and humanity. And in addition to that, we're going to see the emergence of religious movements out in, the countryside or in cities where people are beginning to feel very down about the way in which this country is going. Many turn to God for their solutions. And a lot of the preachings of the Second Great Awakening have to do with greed and suffering and sin, where people are moving into these urban environments where crime is on the rise, alcoholism is on the rise. And this is going to lead to a movement in which we sort of see an inspired reform against these different issues. And this is where we see the emergence of the Mormons, who don't try to necessarily reform issues in the cities, but instead move. They go and pursue their own sort of destiny out on the West Coast in Zion, right? Which would ultimately be, their final settlement in Utah. Just as one example, there are other movements which are utopian in nature, like Oneida or the Shakers or other millenarian groups who sort of form their own religious communities outside of the city because they see the city as becoming increasingly a place of corruption, of greed, of ungodliness, stuff like that. And then there's also, secular groups like Brook Farm, who is not religious in nature, but believes that, we need to get out of these places of reform and live true, like to the transcendentalist cause. And so again, I jumped ahead, but here are some examples of these utopian groups. I show here on the left, one of these groups in which we see men and women sort of dancing with one another. So kind of cool. Okay, wrapping up here, we have reform movements and abolition in the United States. So one of the big issues we talked about was the cult of domesticity, this idea that a woman's right to work was not really a thing. And so as a result, we're going to start to see, the young ladies who become more educated in the early 1800s, thanks to Republican motherhood at the end of Unit 3, we're going to start to see these women grow up, and they are going to fight for a woman's right to vote, a woman's right to work. And this is going to lead to the Seneca Falls Conference in 1848, where we see our big first feminist movement sort of event where these women are fighting for the right to vote. They're seeking women getting a greater degree of independence. And for example, we see the issuing of the Declaration of Sentiments by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who basically takes the Declaration of Independence and flips it on its head to make the point that women need a sense of independence in this country. In addition to that, there are people who see crime on the rise, and because there are many people in these prisons who, are being treated very poorly, Dorothea Dix is going to emphasize that we need to move away from our prisons become overcrowded and get these people who may be mentally disabled, intellectually disabled, or suffering from a mental illness to have, a chance to, just be cared for, or, try to be rehabilitated rather than being punishment for crimes that they couldn't really control themselves from committing. And here's an example of an asylum. A lunatic asylum is not something that we would necessarily say today is progressive, but during this time, this was considered progress in general. Another big movement that we're going to see is temperance, where the American Temperance Society and the Washingtonian Temperance Society are going to be inspired by their religious values and try to have people cut back on alcohol. I mean, people were drinking tons, like 7 gallons of pure alcohol a year. I mean, that's pretty significant, right? It's a public health crisis. And people are inspired by their religious values to go and try to tamper down on the amount of drinking in this country. An example of this we looked at in class was The Drunkard's Progress. Here's another example. It's a fictional story that was written and published and sent out to people called 10 Nights in a Barroom, where, a man gets hooked on alcohol. He goes out of the house, he goes drinking. And when his daughter goes to try and take the dad and bring him home, she's ultimately killed accidentally in a bar fight. And the dad sobers up as a result after this significant loss and becomes a model citizen. And so this is an example of how the temperance tried to draw on the heartstrings and really emphasize the fact that it was families, women and children that suffered at the hands of whether it was domestic abusers or husbands who became so addicted to alcohol that they could no longer, carry on a profession and things like that. We're also going to see an emphasis on public education during this time period. Horace Mann is going to try and open up schools, which could help get both native-born Americans and immigrants a shot at becoming successful in this country by pursuing an education. This is also, we hope, would limit poverty down the line. And then the very last thing we talked about was slavery and abolition. Obviously, during this time period, slavery is on the rise thanks to the cotton gin. Slavery is going to begin expanding from South Carolina and Georgia, where we saw cotton being grown primarily, out all the way to Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas. Part of that is because a lot of the soil's fertility is going to get sort of taken out by cotton. Cotton really leads to poor soil production. And so we're going to see that as stuff dries out and people are going to move west to pursue that sort of thing. Slaveholding states prior to the Civil War, if we look here, the South is in the red, is going to be where slaves are held. And so just to give you a sense of where slavery existed. Slavery is going to quadruple over the course of the early 1800s as the cotton gin becomes, it leads to a major increase in the demand of slavery. Slave owners lived lives of luxury. They had very paternalistic attitudes, like they were like the dads of the people on the plantation, and that they should treat them like children, despite the fact that enslaved peoples were largely adults. We're also going to see that despite the fact that 3/4 of the white population in the South did not own slaves, many of them still defended this institution. Many felt as though that one day they too would become slaveholders. But there was lots of different examples of resistance to slavery during this time period. For example, we would see people sabotaging work. This is very common, breaking tools, working very slowly on purpose. In addition to that, education would be an example of resistance to slavery. Learning to read was illegal for a lot of enslaved peoples. And so this was a way in which people tried to get around that by learning to read, was a big tactic. Saw the Underground Railroad. I just want to point out that despite the fact that many people did get away on the Underground Railroad, it's a very slim number relative to the number of people that would be enslaved for their entire lives. We can't use the Underground Railroad as a coping mechanism for the horrors of slavery. In addition to that, we would have violent revolutions. We saw Nat Turner killed, I want to say 56 white people during his rebellion, which is, significant and just shows how far people were willing to go to resist this institution. Denmark Vesey wanted to have almost like our own Haitian Revolution, where this massive uprising of enslaved peoples, and this would lead to harsher implementation of slave codes often. And in the United States, we have to remember there are 500,000 freed African Americans by 1860. So in the Northeast in particular, where slavery was being outlawed over time, these African American folks would be, they'd become part, regular members of society, but not necessarily with the full rights of sort of their white counterparts. Like, that's important to emphasize, that despite the fact that they might have had their freedom, they would not have the right to vote, more limited job opportunities, and things of that nature. So folks, that is our Unit 4 review. I think in general, I just want to point out that while slavery was a big issue, obviously there are people beginning around the country to fight for slavery's end. We call that the abolitionist movement, right? And this is a key part of these reform movements, which are emerging in the antebellum period. And abolitionism looked very different depending on who you talk to. Some abolitionists said that Black folks should be freed and returned to Africa, which I know sounds kind of ridiculous in 2025, but that was considered progressive, like woke, so to speak, like would be like considered like really out there, but also progressive mindset. We had folks that were very radical who said slave owners need to be punished and they should have no political rights and that they should not be negotiated with. Like William Lloyd Garrison, who had the Liberator newspaper. And then finally, we have Black abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, Solomon Northup, too many to count, who were enslaved and told their stories to try to achieve racial justice and emerge out of slavery. And so as we end here, our next unit, we're going to sort of see Manifest Destiny. I'm going to ignore that. Folks, listen, good luck on your test. You guys are going to kill it. Email with questions, pop over Wednesday morning, hopefully snow day tomorrow. Thanks for watching, and I hope this video has been helpful for you guys. Have a great rest of your day. And again, sorry I couldn't do a live review.